All right, everyone, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Welcome to our Tour Reunion 2015. Thank you all so much for coming here, and thank all of you who are watching this online. Welcome to you as well. We're here to talk about our tours in Eastern Europe. That's our Best of Eastern Europe tour, our Adriatic tour, and our Prague and Budapest tours. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Cameron Hewitt. Like a lot of us here at Rick Steves, I wear a lot of different hats. For one thing, I'm a tour guide, and I've enjoyed leading all of these tours over the years, the ones that we'll be talking about here today. In fact, Marian and I and a couple other guides helped kind of create the itinerary for the Adriatic tour, so that one's very near and dear to our hearts. I'm also one of our guidebook researchers and writers. I'm the co-author of our Eastern Europe, Croatia, Slovenia, and Budapest guidebooks. So whether I'm touring or working on my guidebook, I get to go to these wonderful places several times a year. I have two guides on the stage with me. I'm going to have them introduce themselves a little bit later. We've got Marian from Slovenia and Katka from the Czech Republic, and we'll be hearing from them throughout the course of this show tonight as we go. I'd like to start by just giving you a little bit of a taste of what is there for you to see in Eastern Europe. And the first thing I think that's important when you're going to Eastern Europe is to try to pry open those Cold War blinders. I think a lot of people still look at Eastern Europe through this prism of the Cold War, the evil empire, the Iron Curtain. And there is a lot of important history that took place during that period, but it's just one small chapter of the history of these countries. You might think of Eastern Europe as a very intimidating place, a very unfriendly place. And sure, you can find that, but these days it's not something to be frightened of. It's something to kind of have fun with and to remember, put it in its context. You have to go looking for museums to find these statues of Lenin and Stalin and so forth. It's not something that dominates the life of Eastern Europe today. A lot of you might think of Eastern Europe, if you haven't been there, having been behind the Iron Curtain, as being a gloomy, kind of depressed place. And there is a little bit of that as well. But a huge part of Eastern Europe doesn't look anything like this. It looks a little bit more like this. These are absolutely beautiful countries populated by wonderful people, and it's really a joy of ours to be able to tell you all about these wonderful countries that we'll be talking about. By the way, I'm using the term Eastern Europe to describe these countries. If you ask Marian and Katka, or really anyone who lives in these countries, they would say it's not Eastern Europe, it's Central Europe. This is an interesting little semantic debate. In the US, we think of them as Eastern Europe because they were behind the Iron Curtain and so forth. Politically, we think of them more in that direction. People who live there would point out that that's geographically indistinct and geographically incorrect. This is really the very heart of Europe. And culturally, they don't feel like they're part of the cultural orbit of Moscow. They feel very much European. So I'll use the term Eastern Europe just for the convenience of those of you who think of it that way. But when you get there, you might be trained by one of your guides to think of it as Central Europe, the way that they do. Let me just tell you a few things that you're going to see when you go to Eastern Europe. First of all, you've got some wonderful cities, gorgeous cities, some of the finest cities in Europe, of course. Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic. Krakow, the cultural capital of Poland. Budapest, one of my favorite big cities in Europe anywhere. This is the capital of Hungary. Lots of unique experiences in Eastern Europe as well. These are the thermal baths of Budapest. We'll tell you more about those as the talk goes on. Down on the coastline of Croatia, which is included in both of these tours, you've got gorgeous seaside towns, small towns like Rovinj, large towns like Dubrovnik. It's a great place to get a little taste of the diversity of Europe. This is really a crossroads of European culture, Eastern Europe. So for example, on our Adriatic tour, we take a little trip into Bosnia, which has more of a Turkish feel. The majority of the population is Muslim. It just has a very different feel from what you might expect, just a short drive away from the beaches of Croatia. I think also that southern part of this area, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, the real strength of that area is the natural beauty. I think it may be the most naturally gorgeous part in all of Europe. You've got the rolling hills and hill towns and vineyards that you see here in northern Croatia. You've got the waterfall wonderland of the Plitvice Lakes, also in Croatia. Crystal clear waters of the Adriatic, great place to go for a dip, get refreshed partway through a busy tour. Up in the Slovenian Alps, you've got gorgeous alpine lakes. This is Lake Bled and a traditional boat that we'll row out to an island on. Sparkling high mountain rivers and cut glass peaks, all of this up in the northern part of Slovenia. As you'll see, there's a lot of natural wonders, a lot of great cities, and a lot of wonderful towns to hang your hat in. This is Dubrovnik, and after a busy day of sightseeing, there's no street I'd rather walk down at the end of the day than this one, the main drag of Dubrovnik. For all of its tangible attractions, though, for me, Eastern Europe, one of its biggest appeals are the wonderful people that you'll meet there. Now, I love Western Europe too. I have nothing against Western Europe, but I find when I travel there, people there are a little jaded when it comes to tourism. They're maybe a little bit tired of all the tourists coming through. Now, don't get me wrong, Eastern Europe has been past communism for 25 years. It's very Western, it's very modern, it's very worldly. But there is a certain novelty still to tourism. They really appreciate that you came to Poland because they know everyone goes to Italy, but only a few hardy travelers come to Poland. So I really feel like travelers in this area get a special dose of warmth and great ways to connect with the locals. On our tours, for example, whether you're dancing the czardas with a Hungarian vintner's wife, tasting a Czech beer with the person who brewed that beer, getting to know a local family, buying produce in the market. Whatever you do, however you do it, I think that some of the most wonderful people connections that you have in Eastern Europe are, for me, some of the biggest treats that you have when traveling there. As you probably know, here at Rick Steves, we have something like 40 different itineraries covering all of Europe, and I'm going to focus today on these, quote, Eastern Central European countries. We're really talking about 6 or 7 countries that kind of cut a swath right down the middle of Europe. By the way, I'll go back to that picture just to show you geographically. This is really the center of Europe. When you think that Europe extends all the way over here, there's a reason why they call it Central Europe. These itineraries focus on, I would say, the westernmost, most accessible parts of Eastern Europe. That would be the Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia down here. We have 3 different itineraries in this region. This is the first one. I'll go through the 2 main ones in order so you can see all the stops. This is the first one. This is the survey tour. This is the best of Eastern Europe. If you've never really thought about traveling here and you want to first once over lightly just to get a sense of which countries you like, which you might want to go back to, this is the one for you. 16 days, starting in Prague, heading into Krakow, Poland, a few days here in Hungary, and then at the end we end in Croatia and Slovenia. Again, I'll do a day-by-day rundown a little bit later here. We also have, for people with limited time who want to see the 2 best cities of Eastern Europe, the 2 big powerhouse cities, there's a 7-day Prague and Budapest tour, split evenly between those 2 cities. And then this is the other itinerary that picks up sort of where that first one left off, where you just get a taste of Croatia, Slovenia. Now we have this Adriatic tour, 14-day Best of the Adriatic tour. Basically, it's a week in Slovenia and northern Croatia, followed by a week down on the Dalmatian coast of Croatia with a little side trip into Bosnia. There's a lot of things as a tour guide that I love about Rick Steves tours. For one thing, we've got nice small groups. Usually the size of the group is in the mid-20s, and that makes a big difference because you can get into places, restaurants, hotels, experiences with a group that size that you wouldn't be able to get into with a larger group. So that, for me, is a real treat. I also really appreciate that we have a very strict no grumps policy on our tours. And I will say that's very much honored on this tour in particular. The thing I find about the Eastern Europe itineraries, maybe compared to some others, we have a lot of people on this tour who've traveled a lot on their own, often independently, in other countries like Germany or France or Italy. They just want a little bit more help in Eastern Europe. It's, to them, a little more unfamiliar. The languages are less familiar. They know the history, especially the recent history, is complex, so they really appreciate that extra help. What that means from a practical perspective is I find we get very worldly, smart, adventurous, curious, well-traveled people on these tours, which as a tour guide, I really appreciate. Of course, you know, Rick Steves tours, it's not about taking you to Europe and showing you the big sights on a platter. We want to immerse you in the sights of Europe. We want you to be a temporary European, whether it's historical sites or contemporary politics. We want you to really understand the things that are going on in that place. One example of this on this Eastern Europe tour, in the little village in northern Hungary, we enjoy taking our Eastern Europe tour members to a school where you get to actually meet the students and interact with them and learn what it's like to be growing up in a small town in Hungary. And for me, maybe the most important thing that I love about Eastern Europe tours is we have really excellent tour guides. There's about 100 tour guides here today in Edmonds as a part of our Test Drive a Tour Guide events. I've got 2 of them right here with me on stage. Before I introduce them, I'd like to virtually introduce you to a few other great guides that you might encounter in Eastern Europe. And each of these folks is a brilliant tour guide. They all add something special to this tour. There's Peter. He lives in Budapest. He loves showing people around his hometown. Really an exceptional guide. Tina lives in the mountains of Slovenia, and she loves taking people out onto springy suspension bridges over crystal clear mountain rivers to give them a thrill. Etelka loves the wine of her home region in the northern part of Hungary, loves to enjoy taking people to do wine tastings there. And by the way, at these Rick Steves events, we often highlight our European guides, and they're fantastic. But we also have a bunch of fantastic American guides who are every bit, in some ways, as European as the Europeans. They weren't born there, but a lot of them live in Europe and have a real passion for it. Ben Curtis, for example, he's a professor in Seattle at Seattle University of Eastern European history. So then in the summer, when he's off from classes, he takes tour groups around Eastern Europe. And boy, you can imagine driving around a bus with Ben, who's a really fun guy on top of it all, is like a rolling graduate level classroom about Eastern European history. It's a really exciting opportunity to learn about this place from someone who's really passionate and knowledgeable about it. And two of our guides are right here, so I'd like each of them to introduce themselves.
Dobrý večer. Dobrý večer means good evening. It's almost the evening. My name is Katerina, or maybe to be precise in the pronunciation, Kateřina Svobodová. Svobodová, it's a great last name because the word svoboda means freedom. Freedom we finally have after 25 years of pretty difficult times. I do lead these Eastern Europe itineraries, also Berlin, Prague, Vienna, and also Prague, Budapest. I also do city guiding locally in Prague. I do live there now. I was born like 1 hour and 20 minutes. That's long distance in my country. From there, but I moved to Prague because of university studies in '96, and since then I've been living there.
And my name is Marian Krišković. I actually call 2 countries on these itineraries my home. I have today a Croatian flag, but I was born in Slovenia, where I predominantly live today. Still have 2 homes, lived in both places, parents from both places. And nowadays, after more than a decade, I guide itineraries from best of Eastern Europe in the east to best of Western Europe in the west and most things in between. And I like the variety, but it's always a special privilege when I can greet people in my own home countries and introduce them to the culture, the food, and everything my corner of the world has to offer. And I think within the next hour and a half or so, you will get to see some of those highlights.
Great, thank you very much. We're very lucky to have Katka and Marian here today. And they'll be providing some color commentary during my talk, so a few times I'll give them a chance to tell you their take on these places and these things that we do on our tours. By the way, if you'd like to follow along on this itinerary, or if you'd like to just know more about all of our tours, you can pick up our tour brochure. They're available out in the lobby. If you're watching this online at home, you can just click over to our tour website to follow the itinerary, learn more about all of our tours. And of course, the website's a great source of information about everything we do, not just our tours. Our TV shows are all streaming free on our website. Our radio shows and podcasts are all available for free on our website. Mountains of articles and other kind of information to help you plan your trip. So be sure to look around ricksteves.com to get all of those details. And of course, my specialty is really the guidebooks, and we have several guidebooks that cover this itinerary in this region. And if you take one of our tours, you'll get one of the Rick Steves guidebooks to go along with it to help you know what to do in your free time and so forth, and read up before you get there. Let's get into the day-by-day rundown for this Best of Eastern Europe in 16-day tour. Again, we start with 3 days in the Czech Republic. That's 2 in Prague and 1 in a small village in the eastern part of the country. 3 nights Krakow. We drive through Slovakia to Hungary, where we have 1 night in a small town called Eger, 3 nights in the big city of Budapest. And then to finish, we see the waterfalls in Croatia's Plitvice Park, our little island, not quite island, but Adriatic village of Rovinj, and we end up in the Slovenian mountains at Lake Bled. And I'm just going to, as quickly as I can, get to give them time to talk as well. I'll quickly trace through some of the things you'll see and do on our tours. Our tours start where a lot of people start in Eastern Europe, and that's the Czech Republic. It's a very logical first entry point into Eastern Europe. For one thing, it's the westernmost part of Eastern Europe. Prague is actually significantly west of Vienna. It kind of took a big bite out of the NATO's buffer zone back in the Cold War. And to this day, Czech Republic and Prague still feels like maybe the most accessible Western place, good place to start your tour. And of course, a really spectacular city. It's really hard not to be totally enchanted by Prague, whether you visit on your tour or on your own, or it's your first time or your 10th time. Prague is a magnificent city. Historically, Prague was actually 4 different towns, so I'm going to take a quick spin through each of the 4 towns of Prague to give you a sense of what you'll see there. I'm going to start with the new town of Prague, and the main square of the new town called Wenceslas Square. As you can see, it's almost more of a boulevard than a square. This is really the urban, modern, contemporary part of Prague. This is where you might actually see more locals than tourists walking the streets. It's very busy and bustling, lots of shopping, lots of commerce. It's a great chance to get a sense of the real city. At the top of the square, you have a statue of Wenceslas, good King Wenceslas of Christmas Carol fame. Well, he was actually a 10th century Bohemian duke. He was the first person who kind of unified all the disparate Bohemian tribes into something resembling a nationality, and he's still very much honored today. In addition to the old history that you'll learn about in Prague, there's a lot of recent history that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention, if you don't know what to look for. So here's an example. This is a picture of Hansa Vihan. He's a good friend of ours and one of our tour guides. He leads these itineraries, and he also works as a local guide in Prague. So even if he's not your main tour guide, he might be your local guide for the time that you're in Prague. He couldn't be with us here today, but I always think about him when I think about walking through the city's streets of Prague. And you might come across a little plaque like this one, and just walk right past it, not think anything about it. But if you're with a great tour guide, he'll say, now wait a minute, this is really important, don't miss this. Let's see, let's look at this date, November 17th, 1989. What was going on in November of 1989? Well, the Berlin Wall had just fallen about a month before. So all of these Czechs who were fed up with the communist system had watched on TV as all these East Germans were dancing on top of this symbol of communist oppression. This happened to be the day that the Czech students came together to celebrate the national poet. And after the officially government-sanctioned celebration, a bunch of students said, we're fed up with this. Let's go have an impromptu demonstration back on Wenceslas Square. So they started walking across town. It was about a 2-mile walk. They were getting close to Wenceslas Square, in the place where this plaque is situated. And all of a sudden, they realized that the riot police, the communist riot police, had surrounded them. They were walking down a shopping gallery, and they were totally closed in. The only way to get out of the shopping gallery was to run down a line of cops who were hitting them all with nightsticks as they ran past. The students managed to escape. They whimpered their way home. Their parents were furious. And the next day, a small protest in honor of these students took place on Wenceslas Square. And the next day, there was a slightly larger protest on Wenceslas Square. And over the course of about 10 days, something like 100,000 people turned out on Wenceslas Square to demonstrate for the end of communism. Václav Havel, who had been a playwright and a philosopher, he'd been jailed by the regime, resurfaced as sort of a symbol of the idea of a free Czech Republic, free Czechoslovakia. And finally, after about 10 days, the Communist Politburo of Czechoslovakia simply voted itself out of existence. Wow. They call it the Velvet Revolution because not a shot was fired to secure the freedom for the country. This is really stirring history, stirring recent history. And as amazing as it is, it's even more amazing when it's Hansa who's telling you about it, because it was he, as a 12-year-old kid, who got stuck with his big sister in one of these protests and beat by the riot police cops. The people that you'll meet in Eastern Europe, the guides on stage with me here today, these are people who have lived the most exciting era of their own history, and they get to tell you about it firsthand. That is a really exceptional opportunity to learn about where the line blurs between current events and history. We're going to continue in Prague into the Old Town. This is the Old Town Square, which is just a magnificent public space. There's well-preserved examples of every architectural era. I love to, when I'm taking a tour into Prague on the first night, what I love to do is, without telling them anything, I love to just walk my group into the middle of this square and just let them look around for the first time with their own eyes at the magnificence of the Old Town Square of Prague. And invariably, after a couple of minutes, someone nudges me excitedly and says, "This is better than Disneyland." And it really is, because Prague is well preserved. It's all original. You know, a lot of Eastern European cities and Western European cities had to be rebuilt after World War II, not Prague. It's one of the only major European capital cities in the East that wasn't destroyed by the bombs of World War II. So it's all very well preserved. Now, we're going to make sure that you get to see all of the big important sites, of course. This is the famous astronomical clock of Prague. It's a very complex mechanism. It tells you the phase of the moon. It tells you the time on 2 different clock dials. It tells you whose saint day is today. And at the top of the hour, when the hour is struck, the little windows at the top open, and the 12 apostles shuffle past, and the little skeleton tips his hourglass. And it's a really fun show to watch, but it's even more fun for me to turn around and watch the hordes of crowds who show up to stare up and watch the little show. Folks, Prague is very crowded. It can be a real headache to run into a human traffic jam like this if you're trying to enjoy the sights. The great thing about going on a tour is your guides know where all the crowds are, and we're going to do our very best to help you avoid those crowds. I'll give you an example later on, but we'll do our best to make sure you don't get stuck in this sort of a scene when you're touring the sights of Prague. Right near the Old Town Square, still in the Old Town, we also like to take groups to see the Jewish Quarter. I think this is the most interesting, best presented, I would say, museum about Jewish culture in Eastern Europe. They've basically taken several different synagogues. Some of them have been gorgeously renovated, so you can see synagogue architecture over many different centuries. And each one contains different museum exhibits, so you can learn about this very important strand of Czech and Slovak history. And there's some really poignant sites there as well. This is the Pinkas Synagogue, and inscribed on the walls of the synagogue are the names of the more than 77,000 Czech Jews who were executed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. You can literally, by town, find the name of just about everyone they have a record of having been killed during that time. And what's very powerful about this is you're looking at these names, and if you tune into it, you'll hear a voice on a recorded loop very quietly reading the names aloud of each of the people who was killed. Very, very powerful experience. Just outside of the Pinka Synagogue is the Old Jewish Cemetery of Prague. You can't tell from these pictures, but it's actually about 6 or 8 feet above street level. That's because, as in a lot of cities, in Prague, Jewish people were forced to live in a very small territory. They only had so much space for their cemetery, so rather than cremate, which was against their tradition, they would just bury bodies on top of each other, and then they would stack all of the headstones on the top. And so you walk through this very evocative cemetery with all these topsy-turvy headstones. Very, very poignant experience. Prague is sometimes called the Golden City of 100 Spires. I mentioned how well preserved it is, and I've had people on my tours, we have a free hour in the afternoon, and they say, what should I do with myself? And I say, you know what, some people enjoy just strolling through the streets of Prague, because around every corner, even in the non-touristy areas, sometimes especially in the non-touristy areas, you'll just stumble upon gorgeous architecture from every period. Again, even people who don't think they're interested in architecture find something to get excited about here in Prague. Prague, for example, is one of the great cities for Art Nouveau in Europe. This is the Municipal House, which is kind of the pinnacle of Czech Art Nouveau, right in front of the Gothic Powder Tower. You can see centuries of architectural development in the same block. After hours, Prague has a lot of activities, and most of the time we give you your evenings free, but we can give you plenty of advice about how to spend that time. Prague is a city with a great musical heritage. This is a wonderful group called the Prague Castle Orchestra. If you were at the parties here in Edmonds earlier today, you might have seen them performing. They've been performing at the gates of the Prague Castle for the last probably 20 years or more. They're my favorite street performers anywhere, street musicians anywhere in Europe. They're actually here in town in Edmonds. We brought them in, Rick flew them in for this festival. And I wanted to let you all know, when this class finishes at 7 o'clock, in about an hour, they're going to be doing a live 30-minute concert right here on this stage. So you don't have to go to Prague to see Prague's best street musicians. So sit tight for that, and if you're watching at home, it'll also be streamed at home as well. That's just music that's out in public. If you want to go to a concert, well, for one thing, you'll be approached by chain-smoking Mozarts as you walk through town. But keep in mind, the guys approaching you with brochures are only selling tickets for their concerts. And if you have a good tour guide, they'll say, you know what, don't just take the first concert that approaches you. Go to the Via Musica box office. It's just a block off of the Old Town Square. And there's a great facility there where you have pictures of all the different venues and programs for all the concerts, and you can make an informed decision and pick the right concert for you for when you're in town. There's another option that you have in the evening in Prague, and it's called Blacklight Theater. And it's really a uniquely Czech experience that I really am not equipped to explain. So I'd like Katka, our Prague native guide, to tell us a little bit about Blacklight Theater.
All right. Well, so as you can see, she's flying. How come? That's the magic of the black light. It's actually a very interesting type of a theater. A more like alternative type, going back to the 60s. That was also great that we could hide a lot of things behind the meaning. And it was quite important back in the 60s, you know, 70s too, of course, 80s in my country, because we could not easily express ourselves, even though this is not the case. This is more about a fairy tale. You may know Alice in Wonderland, and this is the aspects of Alice, what we play in Ta Fantastica. To explain the black light, the best is just to go and see. But of course, the good part of it maybe is that our language is pretty complicated. So if you want to go for some drama, you know, some theater, it's of course hard without the knowledge of language. But here, you don't need any language. It's pantomima, dancing, these magics happening on the stage. Sometimes we also do the combination with the projection on the screen, like behind the dancers. So we have like couple of different types of it. This one being one of the, let's say, most traditional. And in my opinion, because I've seen many, I always go to new and new because we have about 10 or 15 of blacklight theaters in Prague these days. Ta Fantastica being the first one, among the first one, and as for the concept, this is a concept of one local artist called Jiří Srnec, if you ever heard about him. If not, you can look him up. And he's back in town. He is also running another theater. So either this or his theater would be for the most traditional performance of the black light. Always the dancers are kind of dressed in fluorescent colors. And the magic of the black light, of course, I cannot tell you because you must come and explore and experience it. In some of the theaters, they tell you a little bit about the magic, you know, how it happens that people are levitating or not. But then what I like on the other one is that it's something different. We usually play, or they usually play pantomima, like a story, what's interrupted by the dancers of it. So either this more poetic type of blacklight theater or the modern. But also Cameron was talking about the smoking Mozarts, and so my city is very big in classical music. If any of you are into it, big venues, small concert halls, or churches. A lot of churches in my country became to be converted into the concert halls, basically. Also because of the times of communism, when we could not really easily go for services, at least we could still use the churches for this purpose, for going for classical music concert or so. So if you come to my city, you can have 10 up to 20 events every single day going on, especially during the season, and you can just simply decide. And I surely recommend blacklight just because it's very unique, and it's then Czech. We developed it somehow, and I think that you don't see it really anywhere else. Maybe a little bit of some similarity, Cirque du Soleil, a little bit like that. That might be a little bit more familiar to you. Not really acrobats going up and down like they go, but a little bit of that. I would say that it may be similar. And except of this blacklight, classical, jazz. It's another important thing. Not just on the streets, but we have a lot of jazz bars. It's part of our culture. We have a lot of this New Orleans, I think we call it New Orleans type of jazz, but all played by the Czech musicians. I think it's also because we do focus on music since we are little. We have it as part of our education. When we go to school, we are 6 years of age. We actually have classes of music, all of us. 6 to 14, we start. If we like it, we just keep going in after-school activities, and then even later, then we become professionals. So Prague, it's a very big musical and theatrical city, if you're into that field.
Well, thank you, Katka. Yes, that was great. Great explanation. It is a uniquely Czech experience that we enjoy. Giving our tour members an option to do. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's a good opportunity for people. We were nearing the end of our time in Prague. Again, we have 3 nights there on this tour. When we leave Prague, it's a part of our tour that our guides really particularly enjoy. We go to the eastern part of the Czech Republic, which is a region called Moravia. And after 3 intense days in the big city, we really like having a chance to let down. So we take you to a village. It's actually like a little settlement at the top of a mountain with traditional wooden architecture. And it's a great day just to kind of decompress, enjoy some nice scenery on the bus. We check into our hotel. We have dinner in a nice traditional wooden structure. And you actually have an opportunity to do a little bit of hiking. So it's a great chance to just hike through the Czech wilderness and get a feel for the nature of the country. And then after dinner, we have a folk performance. And this is a really fun activity that we love because it's not some tourist attraction in a big city. This is people who live in the village They all have their own traditional costumes. Some of them have been passed down from father to son. They're singing in their language, their own words, the songs that their fathers and their grandfathers taught them. And it's just a really powerful experience because, again, it's not a packaged performance on stage, but these people who live in this village who come together just to perform for us and give us a taste of this culture that they're so proud of. So that's a very, very popular part of the tour and a nice break from the big city. After we leave there, we head across the border into Poland. And, you know, I wish we could spend a whole tour in Poland. It's a huge, wonderful country. But on this tour, we just cut through the bottom southern part of Poland, Auschwitz, which I'll talk about here in a moment, and then Krakow, which is a beautiful city in the southern part of Poland. On our way into Poland, our first stop geographically is the concentration camp memorial at Auschwitz-Birkenau. There's a picture here of it. That's an extremely powerful experience for a lot of people, as you can imagine. This is a place where something like an estimated at least 1 million people were executed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. It's kind of a poignant experience to do it right when we get into Poland, of course, because this was not a Polish phenomenon. It was a Nazi-German phenomenon from the outside. But it's very, very powerful. We hire a local guide to walk us through the camp and explain the story. It's called Auschwitz-Birkenau because there's actually 2 parts to the camp. Auschwitz is the main part, Auschwitz I they call it, is the main part of the camp. This was actually an old Polish military barracks that was later converted into a prison camp. And each of the buildings in Auschwitz I has been turned into a museum exhibition, where you go in and the guide explains through visual aids and a lot of actual artifacts the history of what happened here in Auschwitz. Then we get on the bus and we go about 5 minutes to the second part of the camp, which is called Birkenau. Birkenau is a huge, kind of mind-bogglingly huge facility that could hold 100,000 prisoners at one time. And they had 4 crematoria that were working all the time to burn the bodies that were coming in. It's so powerful and so huge, you could never walk the whole thing, but they've actually reconstructed some barracks near the front that we can go in and see these terrible conditions that prisoners were forced to live in. In the middle of Birkenau, there's a railroad track platform that's famously called the dividing platform. And this is where a Nazi officer, doctor, would stand and people would come in on a train and unload, and he would take one look at them and decide, just based on how they look, whether they would go one direction, which meant that they would survive a little bit longer and be registered and live and be forced to work in terrible conditions, or the other direction, which meant that they would go directly to the gas chamber. It's incredibly powerful and moving, as you can imagine, to be standing in the place where these things happen. We have surveys at the end of our tour where we ask, what was your wow moment? What was the thing that really struck you? And I would say that the experience of touring Auschwitz-Birkenau with an excellent local guide to explain everything often ranks one of the highest, most memorable moments on this tour. We like the memorable moment to be something positive. In this case, it's something very powerful, but very, very important. From Auschwitz, we continue on our way deeper into Poland, and we get a nice break from the intensity of the city and the heavy history of Auschwitz by going to this beautiful town called Krakow. Krakow is not the capital of Poland, but it used to be. About 500 or 600 years ago, they moved the capital officially up to Warsaw. But in medieval times, it was the capital. It's the seat of the Polish castle. It's sort of the cultural and intellectual capital of Poland even to this day. The most prestigious university is there. You could call it sort of the Boston of Poland. And it has one of the most beautiful main squares that you'll see anywhere. Probably the most spectacular public space you're going to find anywhere on the Eastern Europe tour is the main square of Krakow. And Mari and I were talking about this, and he was telling me how much he enjoys taking groups to sorry, it was Katka, actually, was telling me she enjoys taking groups through the main square of Krakow and how much she just loves the atmosphere there. So Katka, do you want to tell us more about why you enjoy Krakow?
The main square in Krakow, it's really remarkable because, I mean, I know Krakow from my childhood. We could not travel a lot, just around those countries. But I remember, like back in the 80s, late 80s, I was there. And you really could not see that atmosphere that you see there now. It's amazing. You just come little tiny street going to the huge square. It's actually now considered to be the biggest square of our area. It's huge like we would not expect. Maybe a similarity I would see St. Mark's Square in Venice, but no gondolas, no water. But it looks like that. It's beautiful. Renaissance, mostly beautiful facades of buildings, and the most importantly, all the people are out on that square. You can spend there hours. You can enjoy jazz, again, as in my country. You can enjoy just some street musicians. Last time we were there, they had the piano there. Whoever was just passing by could play piano. And all that atmosphere, finally, people could be out, you know, talk to each other and enjoy. That's what I also do with my group. We go there always with the group for dinner, just a little bit behind the square, and then we go and enjoy with the Polish people some of their great drinks, especially tatanka. Interesting, what is that? They drink, well, Zubrovka, it's the vodka, of course, but they drink also the combination of beer and some raspberry juice. Very interesting, and coming from Czech Republic, you know, so beer, of course, I have to try in every single country of the world. So this combination, it's pretty good. So then we just drink and enjoy, and of course, after visiting Auschwitz, we talk about that after. I just let my group always to kind of contemplate a little bit, because it's pretty tough site, but very important, as Cameron was mentioning. So the atmosphere of Krakow gets us again to the next dimension, and we can keep going and explore more of this beautiful region.
Kaka did a great job of explaining the joy of Krakow. It's just a really wonderful town, the kind of place you want to just relax. And it's nice because we have 3 nights there, so you've got plenty of time to slow down your pace and explore. There's lots of good museums in Krakow. There's no one world-class museum, but there's wonderful museums of 20th century Polish art, 19th century Polish art, local history. This very prestigious university has its own museum. And we give you a lot of free time in Krakow for those who'd like to learn a little bit more about each of those topics. And for some folks, they enjoy just kind of relaxing and enjoying their time in Krakow. Another thing that we want to make sure to show you while we're in Krakow is the Jewish quarter there called Kazimierz. Kazimierz is simply a neighborhood just on the outskirts of the center of Krakow. And I mentioned when we were talking about Prague a little bit about the Jewish heritage. Of course, I think for the Eastern Europe itinerary, the Jewish heritage is a very important aspect of many different countries, and perhaps none more important than here in Poland. Poland had, for much of its history, the largest concentration of Jewish people anywhere in the world, right up through the beginning of World War II. And Kazimierz, this neighborhood, represented the Jewish quarter of Krakow. Something like 3/4 of the people who lived in this neighborhood were Jewish. Of course, this neighborhood was very badly hit in the Holocaust. People were taken to concentration camps like Auschwitz. And between after World War II, through communism, this Kazimierz district was kind of forgotten. All the Jewish heritage was kind of brushed under the rug. But then in the 1990s, along came Steven Spielberg, who decided to film the movie Schindler's List in Kazimierz, which is where the events took place. I'm sure you're all familiar with the story of Schindler's List. It was Oskar Schindler, who was a German industrialist living in occupied Poland, was given the right to run a factory. And at some point, he came to have a tremendous amount of sympathy for his Jewish workers. And at great personal risk, and at great personal financial burden, he managed to save the lives of many of his employees, and people even who weren't his employees. Of course, it's a very inspiring story. And visiting Krakow and the neighborhood of Kazimierz, you actually get to see the places where these things happened. Like in Krakow, there are several synagogues that have been turned into museums, and there are cemeteries you can tour. But the most interesting attraction that our tours really enjoy, there's actually an Oskar Schindler's factory museum. The factory where all of this actually took place has been turned into an excellent museum that details the 20th century World War II history of Krakow. And the story of Oskar Schindler and his list. You can even go into his office and see his actual desk where Oskar Schindler sat. So it's very poignant to walk around again with a local guide, hear the story of Oskar Schindler, see the places where all of these things happen. Very powerful. After we have had a few days to kind of take it easy in Poland, we get in our bus and head south. We cross through the country of Slovakia. Halfway through, we stop off at a little town called Levoča, which is a really beautiful, sort of a diamond in the rough town in the mountains of Slovakia. From there, we continue on to a beautiful little town in northern Hungary called Eger. And of all the itineraries stops on this tour, Eger might be the one that you've never heard of, the one you think, why would I go to a little town called Eger? Well, it's just really a delightful small town. It's a great kind of contrast to Budapest, the capital of Hungary, which we'll go to a little bit later. It's a nice chance, again, after 3 days in the city of Krakow, to have a small town break. It's just got a lot of charm, a lot of beautiful old buildings and so forth, and it's got some thermal baths if you'd like to do that. Then the next day, we get up in Eger, and instead of going straight to Budapest, we have a really fun day and really, I think, interesting day where we want to give you a big variety of experience. And Marian wanted to tell you a little bit about what we do on that day that we wake up in the town of Eger on our way to Budapest.
Well, while most travelers definitely come to these parts of Europe drawn by the lure of some of the grand, beautiful cities like Prague or Budapest or Krakow, many times it's the small towns like Eger that really hide some of the most delightful surprises and experiences one can have on a trip like this. So many times going into a new country, we try to give you a small town introduction to a place before we get you overwhelmed with a large city, like in this case Budapest, that is to follow. Just have the chance to enjoy the culture, the locals, away from the usual tourist traps, to see the less traveled places, and Eger is just the perfect place for something like that. So we start off with an easy, free morning. It's a tiny little town. There's a wonderful farmers market that you can explore, see all the produce, all the wonderful food. There's several quirky little cute museums, like a marzipan museum. There's a camera obscura, an 18th century contraption with which you can spy on your other fellow travelers through the town. Some of the most beautiful Baroque architecture and wonderful locals to meet. And after a free morning, we usually head off for the countryside through the, Eger is actually in the middle of a beautiful wine region. And driving through the rolling hills, you could for a second forget there you're in Hungary, but you might mistaken it for Tuscany or someplace else in France. And we actually first stop for lunch at a school. Could be an unusual place, not a usual address for stopping for lunch. But what we do there is we actually meet the English teacher, and we usually find out more about the Hungarian education system, the challenges, the structure, and so on. And then we actually get to meet some of her students. And we sit down together with them over lunch. We have the same things that they have. We see how things look on a day-to-day basis, really see what life looks like in a little out-of-nowhere little Hungarian town, which is something that most travelers don't get to experience. And after this delightful lunch stop, we continue our drive to another nearby community just outside of Eger, where we stop for wine tasting. After all, that's what Eger is most famous for. And we get introduced to some of the delightful wines, like the famous Eger Bull's Blood. But it's not just about the wine, it's again also about the culture. So you saw the image in the beginning of, if you remember, there were some people dancing that was taken right there in one of those wineries. Get to dance the famous Hungarian Csardas. You listen to the tunes of the gypsy musicians, and again, enjoy the wonderful wines. And it's a beautiful community. You have to think there are wonderful baths, hot springs, wines, delicious food. It's just a delightful package for relaxing before, in the late afternoon, you continue on to the grand big capital of Budapest, where we finish the day by having dinner there in one of the many wonderful restaurants that Budapest has to offer. So it's just a typical day that has an incredible amount of variety and also giving you insight into that slice of life that's otherwise so easy to miss.
Yeah, it's another one of the days that I think for tour guides, it's one of our favorite days because we get to show you some different facets, not just the big sights and predictable cities, but some really interesting facets of the place. That very evening, we continue on and set up for the first of 3 nights in Budapest, the capital of Hungary. For my money, this is my favorite big city in Eastern Europe, and it's certainly the biggest city we go to on this tour, about 2.5 million people. Budapest actually used to be 2 different cities. Buda is sort of the hilly, historic half on this side of the Danube River, and Pest is sort of the flat, modern part on the other side of the Danube River. We'll make sure you see both sides of the river. We'll take you over to see the castle overlooking the riverbank there. Like a lot of these big castle complexes in Eastern Europe, You could spend a lot of time seeing all the sites here, but we find it's more successful to be very targeted. We don't want to overwhelm you with information. So we'll just take you on sort of the greatest hits of the castle. Mostly that has to do with this beautiful church called the Matthias Church that's got a gorgeous gilded interior. And then we'll take you out to the terrace out front where there's a statue of St. István, who's one of these great important historic figures of Hungary, overlooking the Danube River. Most of what you want to see, though, in addition to the Buda Castle that I just showed you, most of what you want to see is on the other side of the river. This is the flat, modern part of town called Pest. It's a big city, a pretty sprawling city, decentralized. You really need to get comfortable with public transportation. So obviously, your tour guide is going to give you a very thorough lesson on public transit. Make sure you're comfortable using the metro, trams, and buses. That goes for Prague as well. Anywhere where there's public transportation, we'll make sure you're very comfortable with how to get around, so you feel free to explore on your own as well. A little more fun form of transportation that we also include in the tour is a gorgeous twilight river cruise on the Danube River. And so that's a fun way as the sun sets or after dark as all the lights kind of twinkle on to get a sense of this. Really, it's a really epic city, really a gorgeous city. We're going to also make sure you get a good look at all of the different monuments and buildings in the city like this. This is the Hungarian Parliament building, for example. We'll get an up-close look there, and we'll also get a look at some of the unusual monuments that are nearby there. Yes, that's Ronald Reagan. This statue and this other monument were both put there by the current ruling government. And what I want to make a point with this about is, the great thing about going with a tour guide is it's not just learning about the history, it's learning about the contemporary politics. It's learning about what's going on today in Hungary. For example, this monument just went up this year, and it's very controversial. This is a monument to the Hungarian victims of the Nazi invasion of World War II, which sounds reasonable enough. But this sort of makeshift monument in the foreground tells you that it's not the whole story. And in fact, a lot of Hungarians would say, yes, we were brutalized by the Nazi in World War II, but there were also a lot of Hungarians who collaborated with the Nazis once that invasion took place. And to say that this was all something from the outside and had nothing to do with Hungarians is not quite accurate. These are the works of the ruling party right now called Fidesz. This is Viktor Orbán, who's the Prime Minister of Hungary. And again, this is just an example of how, on our tours, we're not just dedicated to teaching you the old history, but the new history. What's happening today in Budapest. Tomorrow it'll be something else. And the great thing about a tour guide that a guidebook can't replicate is knowing what's happening right now in the country that you're in. For example, just a couple of months ago, you might have heard there were huge protests in Budapest. Hundreds of thousands of people were coming out to protest a tax that was proposed by the ruling party on the internet. They were going to impose a per-use internet tax. In other words, if you download a website, you have to pay the Hungarian government a penny. Obviously, this was very quickly squelched by huge protests. If you were traveling on your own, didn't have a guide to explain it, you might be mystified by all these crowds. But having someone like Marian or Katka to explain it to you is very, very valuable. Lots of beautiful buildings and monuments throughout Budapest. You have this great market hall, one of several market halls throughout the city, but this is really a stunning one. It's got a little bit of touristy kind of souvenir stuff, but it's also a place where locals actually go to buy food. Hungarian food is quite different from the other food. Now, most of the food on this tour, Eastern European food, has this reputation as being pretty heavy and filling. A lot of potatoes and pork and sauerkraut, and all of that's more or less accurate for a lot of these countries. But there is more variety than you might expect. And in Hungary is got some of the most delicious variety. They use a lot of paprika, peppers, tomato. It's a more flavorful, kind of a brighter flavor than you get in other Eastern European countries. And your guide will make sure you get to sample the key specialties in each place. I was mentioning these great monuments all over Budapest. You've got St. István's Basilica. You've got this glorious opera house. It's one of these kind of grand cities like Vienna or Paris that was actually the co-capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for a time. And they really went to town building grand buildings about 100, 150 years ago. And that's really left it with a gorgeous architectural legacy. This opera house, for example, is a great place, and one of your free evenings in Budapest, you could consider taking in a budget opera. It's world-class opera in a gorgeous setting for a fraction the price that you might pay in Vienna or Paris. The story goes that when the Hungarians wanted to build their opera house, Franz Josef, who was the emperor at the time, said, well, you can build an opera house, but it cannot be bigger than the one in Vienna, because he didn't want to be upstaged. So the Hungarians supposedly built one that was a little bit smaller, but twice as grand as the one in Vienna, just to kind of make their point. If you're interested in the history, there's a great museum called the House of Terror Museum. They talk here about the double occupation of Hungary. In other words, the occupation of the Nazis in World War II, followed by the occupation of the communists throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And this is a great museum to learn about both of those chapters of the history. The sites I just showed you are all along this great boulevard called Andrássy út. It's kind of the Champs-Élysées, you could say, of Hungary, of Budapest. And then at the end of the boulevard, instead of an Arc de Triomphe, you have something similar. It's the Millennium Monument that celebrates the great founding fathers of the Hungarian nation. And behind that, you've got a gorgeous city park. This is the Vajdahuda Castle, which is a replica of a Transylvanian castle built for a World's Fair. Transylvania was part of Hungary for most of its history until the end of World War I. So this is an example of Hungary remembering a time when it had a much bigger empire than it has now. The city park in Budapest is a great place to just relax and enjoy and commune with local people and see what people are up to when they're taking a day off. For example, today these guys decided to bring their chessboard, play a game of chess here in City Park. Tomorrow they're going to take their chessboard to the thermal bath and stand waist high or chest high in 100-degree water to play their game. This is something I really highly recommend that you do if you go on a tour. And again, with a tour and a tour guide, they will help you make sure that you know what your options are and help you get the most out of your experience at one of the famous thermal baths of Budapest. This one's called Széchenyi Bath. It's right in the heart of that city park. And Katka, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what it was like and why it's worthwhile for people to take one of these thermal baths in Budapest.
Well, as you can see, it's pretty beautiful building, right? You would think maybe, should I wear my fancy dress tonight? You would actually need the opposite, as you may know, and enjoy socializing with the locals. They come there just to talk, not just play the chess, but just to talk. We usually, or at least I usually take my group to explain, of course, how it works. I go with them too. We just like enjoy. After all this walking, we need some time to relax. We just realized last time it's not good to do it and then to do some sightseeing. We could not walk after we got out of the bath, but it was beautiful, great, relaxing experience. You basically can swim. Once we did even the swimming race among us. That was fun. Or you just go one pool to the other, different temperatures. You just soak up to your neck, basically. And then you can just go to several of them, then to the steam bath, you know, then to the cool pool. And what is the most important thing for men to pack on this tour are Speedos. Have them? This is just normal type of swimsuit in this part of the world. I even heard, if it's true, I'm not sure, that it's actually dangerous when you swim in the shorts, because once you get out of it, you just take all the water, it's slippery, and people can slip and, you know, break their legs. So you just need Speedos, okay? So I hope you're ready for that.
Great, thank you, Katka. I can vouch for the fact that you don't have to wear Speedos at the baths. I wear good old-fashioned swim trunks, but if you want to go local, you should wear the Speedos. No, seriously, you really have to try this. It's the quintessential Hungarian experience. If it sounds intimidating, it's not. It's basically like going to your hometown water park, except you're surrounded by these beautiful Baroque buildings. You're in 100-degree water, and everywhere around you are pot-bellied, Speedo-clad Hungarians. So it's a cultural experience, it's a sightseeing experience, and it's relaxing all rolled into one. I also wanted to just give you an example. This is that main bath building of how far these countries have come. I said earlier in the talk about how don't be stuck on thinking about everything through this Cold War era. I've seen these cities just really spring to life in the last 15 years as they've been recovering. It's really been 25 years. I've been going there about 15 years. This is a picture I took about 10 years ago of the building that we were just talking about, the Széchenyi baths. I went back a few years later, and it looked like this. I mean, it looks like things are being colorized now, the way they're scrubbing off all of those decades of communist soot and fixing things up. This is a really beautiful part of Europe to be experienced. I also wanted to point out, we're still partway through our Best of Eastern Europe itinerary, but there's another itinerary, if you're shorter on time, that works for you. It's just our 1 week in Prague and Budapest tour. We talked about Prague earlier. We just talked about Budapest. If you only have a week's vacation, that can be a good way just to get a taste of these two great cities. Back to our Eastern Europe itinerary, and now we finished the big cities in Eastern Europe, and we're going to kind of relax. This always, as a tour guide, feels to me like this is dessert. We've hit all these great big cities, we've had all these amazing experiences, and it's time to just slow down and enjoy nature and relax a little bit. We're heading into Croatia. Croatia is dominated by its coastline, and we're going to go to one of the coastal towns right here, Rovinj. But first, on the way through, we're going to stop off at, I think, one of the great natural wonders anywhere in Europe, maybe anywhere in the world. This is Plitvice Lakes National Park. And you might not have ever heard of Plitvice Lakes National Park, but you will never forget it, I guarantee you that. It's basically a Grand Canyon filled with 16 terraced lakes. They're all connected by gorgeous waterfalls. And they're ingeniously networked with boardwalk trails that let you walk right over the tops of the lakes and get so close to the waterfalls you can literally feel the spray. First you hear the waterfalls, then you see them, and then you feel them as you walk past. It's really well set up. We can see the best part of Plitvice Lakes in just basically a 2 or 3 hour hike in the morning that we get up here. Everywhere you go, every step along the way, you have gorgeous views of waterfalls. And did I mention the water is crystal clear? Again, Plitvice Lakes is really a trip-capping highlight for a lot of people who never thought they'd be somewhere this beautiful and are amazed they've never heard of this place before. This is really a wonderful stop on this tour. From there, we continue through Croatia, and we set up for a couple of nights of vacation. It's time to take a vacation from our busy vacation, and we like to do that in a town called Rovinj. Rovinj is this beautiful town on the Croatian coast. For me, it's my favorite small Croatian town anywhere between Dubrovnik and Venice. This is just an intoxicating place. It looks like it's being pulled up to heaven by its gigantic Venetian bell tower. I love Rovinj because you can just melt into the back streets and feel like you're in a real fishing village, because you are. I mean, you'll literally see guys mending their nets out in the streets, people drying their laundry. Rovinj has a gorgeous little harbor that's bobbing with a combination of tourist and fishing boats. Local restaurants like to brag in Rovinj. Our seafood is so fresh because the fishermen come in, put it in our harbor, and literally just walk across the street and hand us the day's catch so we can fry it up. This is, again, a nice break from the heavier Slavic food you might have further north. This is also a great chance to take a dip, to get refreshed the way the locals do. I'll warn you that in Croatia, you don't have a lot of sandy beaches. They're rocky beaches. People figure out a way to get comfortable on jagged rocks with a nice towel, and then take a dip in the crystal clear water. That's the trade-off. It's rocky, it's not sandy, but the water is the most clear water that you'll ever swim in. And you have plenty of time for that because you basically have a whole day off in Rovinj. There's an optional happy hour in the evening, but you can spend your day basically any way that you want. What a lot of people like to do after dinner is go out to this fun little cocktail bar called Valentino Cocktail Bar, where they've set up little chandeliers and little pillows on the rocks. You can sit and watch the sun dip slowly into the Adriatic while you have your drink literally on the rocks. And they've got strategic lights placed in the harbor so curious fish come and swim, and you can watch them swim by as you enjoy your drink. This is a great way to unwind near the end of a really busy itinerary. But we're not finished yet. We saved one of my favorite countries for last on this tour. That's Slovenia. Slovenia is a tiny little country, about 2 million people. It's about half the size of New Jersey. But it's an absolutely delightful country. I think it's the most underrated country in Europe. It's stunningly beautiful. It looks like Switzerland or Austria. People are sometimes surprised. This is all part of the former Yugoslavia, and they think, I wouldn't think of these kinds of mountains when I think of Yugoslavia, but Slovenia has that kind of scenery in abundance, especially in the areas that we go to on the tour. First, on our way up through Slovenia, coming up from Croatia, we stop off at the caves called Škocjan Caves. Škocjan Caves are one of several different caves in the southern part of Slovenia where they have these karstic caves, which are basically caves carved out by underwater rivers and creating just beautiful, gigantic caverns filled with dramatic features, dramatic stalagmites and stalactites. By the way, I should mention here, you probably know this, but Rick Steves tours are active tours. You don't have to be an athlete to take our tours, but you want to be in good shape. And Škocjan is a great example of why it pays to get ready for the tour and be ready to do some hiking. To get to the Škocjan caves, you hike downhill, then you hike through the caves, seeing all these dramatic formations, and at the end, you have to hike your way back up. And it is sort of challenging for some of our tour members, and that's fine. You can take your time. But just keep in mind, for Rick Steves tours, you'll get the most experience if you're ready for these sorts of experience. Now we head up to spend the night in Lake Bled. Lake Bled is Slovenia's leading mountain resort up in the northwest corner of the country. Beautiful alpine peaks in the background surrounding a gorgeous lake with a perfect little island in the middle, capped with a perfect little church. What we like to do the morning we wake up here on Lake Bled is we load our tours onto one of these traditional pletna boats. This pletna is a unique kind of boat. They only make it here on Lake Bled. And the way for making the boat is passed down from father to son, generation after generation. So guys like Robert here, who rows us out to the island, has built this boat with his bare hands using the same tools and technology and methods that his father taught him and his grandfather taught him. So wonderful little piece of local lore. We'll row you out to the island where you land at the base of this staircase. 98 stairs lead up to the top of the island. This is a very popular place for weddings in Slovenia. After the wedding, the groom is supposed to carry or attempt to carry his bride up all 98 steps, thereby proving himself fit for marriage. You can choose whether you'd like to carry your spouse to the top or not, but either way, we're going to hike up those stairs and bid a fond farewell to our tour and to Slovenia. If you have a little free time in the afternoon, you can go for a walk all the way around the lake, enjoying ever-changing views of the mountains and the island. And if you want to, you can also hike up to the castle that clings to a cliff above the lake, looking out over the mountains of Slovenia. Now, that is a spectacular itinerary, 16 days, and we really give you the best of Eastern Europe. Think about everything you just saw and doing all of that in basically just over 2 weeks. Think about all the stuff you didn't see, too, doing that over the course of just over 16 weeks. So that's a wonderful itinerary. But there's another itinerary that lets you dig a little bit deeper into the southern part of this region, Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia. And Marian, you and I, about 10 years ago or so, we were doing the Eastern Europe tour, and we noticed that by the end of the tour, our tour members were craving a little more time in Croatia and Slovenia. And you and me and a couple other tour guides hatched this idea for a Best of the Adriatic tour. Now it's one of our better-selling tours. It's a 14-day itinerary that sort of picks up where the Eastern Europe tour leaves off. There's a tiny bit of overlap, but only the very best places overlap, and the rest is all completely new. We start with 3 nights in Slovenia, up in the northern part, Ljubljana 2 nights and 1 in the mountains, in a town called Kobarid. Then we head down and sleep near Rovinj in a hill town called Motovun for 2 nights. We go back to those waterfalls at Plitvice lakes that I showed you earlier. Then the last week of the tour is down on the Dalmatian coast, the big city of Split, the islands of Hvar and Korčula. We take a little side trip into Bosnia, and then we finish up for 2 nights in Dubrovnik at the southern tip. This is a wonderful 2-week look at this part of Europe. By the way, all of these countries were part of the country that was called Yugoslavia, and I can guarantee you a big part of this trip is that your guide will explain all of the complicated history of Yugoslavia, how it came together, how it fell apart. That's beyond the scope of this talk here, but I will say tour members who have gone on this tour with me have, at the end of it, come to me and said, "Thank you so much. I never understood what this Yugoslavia thing was about. 20 years ago, we saw in the news these countries splitting apart. We never really understood it." Going to these places, meeting the people, seeing the places, and having a guide to help tie it all together is incredibly valuable. I mean, basically, this was a country that was formed for the first time at the end of World War I. It barely survived through World War II. Then it had a strong-arm communist dictator called Tito, who you see here, who really held it together by force of his own personality for a few decades. And then after Tito died in the 1980s, it started to unravel without his strong leadership at the hands of guys like Slobodan Milosevic, Radovan Karadzic, Franjo Tudjman. And your guide will explain to you how all of this happened, and you'll see the places where a lot of these events happened. Now there are actually 7 countries where once was one Yugoslavia. This tour goes to 3 of them, Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia. So let's do a quick run through the itinerary of this tour. And some of this will be a little bit of a rerun, because there's a tiny bit of overlap with Eastern Europe, but let me just sort of narrate as well as I can. We start off in Slovenia, as I mentioned. I think it's one of my favorite cities, my favorite small city in Europe. A very underrated country, Slovenia. And we start in the capital city of Slovenia, Ljubljana. Ljubljana. This is just simply an intoxicating small city, about 250,000 people, I believe. A lot of people compare it to Salzburg because it has a castle on top of a hill, and then there's a river running through the center of town, and then there's alpine peaks in the horizon. Just a beautiful, cozy town. It's the kind of town where it feels like people are out for a Sunday stroll any day of the week. It's just got a lot of charm and lazy, easygoing lifestyle, wonderful outdoor cafes, boutiques, shopping, and so forth. And someone on this stage with me is lucky enough, I'm so jealous of him, he's lucky enough to live in this paradise on earth called Ljubljana, and that's Marian. And he wanted to tell us a little bit more about what it's like to live in Ljubljana.
Well, thank you. I'm certainly consider myself lucky to live here. We in Ljubljana like to think of it as the city done to the measure of man. It really unites the advantages of a large-scale city metropolis and a small town, having lots of museums and festivals and culture and so on. But at the same time, it's a small place. It's a place where if you hang out at a riverside bar like this one long enough, you will pretty much sooner or later meet everybody you know. But it's not too small, not too big. In addition to that, it's got lots of green, very low crime rate. And I think something that people enjoy is just this low-key, casual, laid-back atmosphere in the city, backed up also by a large student population that gives it that kind of lively, artsy feel. And ultimately, when you go to Ljubljana, nobody will ask you, well, have you seen this or that? Because there's no Eiffel Tower, there's no Colosseum, there's no grand world scale, not to miss sight. It's just like I said, a city to be enjoyed. You've got beautiful architecture, wonderful food. Ljubljana is really in the heart of Slovenia, and if you saw the images of Lake Bled earlier, at the end of the Eastern European itinerary that was discussed earlier, that's just like a 40-minute drive up north from here. That would be halfway across the country. So within a few hours, you can be either in Venice, in Vienna, in Salzburg. Within the same hour, you could be up in the Alps or down at the Adriatic. There's a lot of variety, and this is a meeting place, a melting pot of different landscapes, cultures, food, and it's all here, like I said, to be enjoyed on the low key and in a very unpretentious, laid-back way.
Great, thank you, Marian. And as you can imagine, Ljubljana is an excellent place to get over jet lag. It's a great place to start your tour. Very low-impact, pleasant place to start out. It's also got wonderful architecture, mostly from the early 20th century, so you've got great buildings in the Art Nouveau style, all easy to see in a very quick walking distance, including some sort of unusual local flair in terms of the architecture. One name you're going to hear a lot about in Ljubljana is this guy, Jože Plečnik. Jože Plečnik is a local architect. He trained in Vienna in the early 20th century and gained fame throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he decided to retire back to his hometown of Ljubljana, where he worked as an architect and an urban planner, and basically remade the whole city in a way that was pleasing to him as a pedestrian who walked to work every day. So to this day, Jože Plečnik's architecture, his bridges, his embankments, and his buildings really shape this very cozy lifestyle of Ljubljana. Of course, on the tour, we'll take you on a walking tour around the town of Ljubljana. Make sure you get a chance to get a good dose of these buildings of Jože Plečnik. I love it when you have an artist or an architect who you've never heard of before, and then you go to a city where he's all over the place or she's all over the place, and you just walk away thinking, there's just so much I don't know. There's so many things I haven't learned because of whatever unfortunate fluke of history that behind the Iron Curtain we never learned about Jože Plečnik in architecture school, but he really is one of the greats. We leave Ljubljana after a couple days and head up north, and we just have a few hours on Lake Bled. You'll remember that from the Eastern Europe tour. Just enough time to walk around the lake if you'd like, get some of the famous local desserts. Then we head up into the mountains, and one thing I love about this tour, it gets you even deeper into the Slovenian mountains. We go up and over the Vršič Pass. The Vršič Pass is a mountain pass with a very dramatic road. It's literally got 50 switchbacks on this road. 24 switchbacks on the way up, 26 switchbacks on the way down. And our bus drivers could literally do it blindfolded because they're all local Slovene mountain bus drivers who grew up in the mountains. All along the way, you've got absolutely breathtaking scenery. And then when you come down the other side, we drive along the Soča River Valley, which is a gorgeous river valley with crystal clear rivers, really fun suspension bridges where you can climb out onto the bridge and take a little bounce. But there's also sort of an overlay of history in this area. The Soča River Valley was the site of some of the fiercest fighting of World War I, not World War II, way back in the early 20th century, World War I. It was called the Isonzo Front. That's the Italian name for the Soča River Valley. If you studied your history, you know the Isonzo Front was a unique form of warfare because most of the fighting didn't take place down in the valleys. It took place on the mountaintops. People in the villages down below could only faintly hear the fighting going on the mountaintops. Unique in military history, what happened here on the Socha front. If you know anything about this, you might have heard about it through the writings of Ernest Hemingway, who drove an ambulance in this area in World War I, and he wrote A Farewell to Arms about his experiences right here along this river valley. So we will learn a little bit about that history. The town we stay in called Kobarid, just above the town is a very interesting Mussolini fascist-style Italian monument to something like 7,000 Italian soldiers who were killed fighting on the Socha front. So you've got this incredible mountain scenery combined with this sort of interesting footnote of local history. It's a great place to just spend the night and watch the moon rise slowly over the Alps. From there, we head down into Croatia, and you'll remember that on the Eastern Europe tour, we spent a couple of nights in the town of Rovinj, which is a really delightful coastal town. On this itinerary, we go to other coastal cities later on. You'll see the second week of the tour is almost entirely along the water. So we wanted to give you a little different flavor of Istria, the region that Rovinj is in. We will take you to Rovinj for a few hours just to take a quick look at it, but then we're going to focus our time on other parts of this peninsula called the Istrian Peninsula. First, we'll take you to the big city of Pula, where you'll find one of the best preserved Roman amphitheaters anywhere in Europe. And the whole city of Pula is a really interesting case where it's built in the ruins of an old Roman city, so you have triumphal arches right in the middle of the city. This isn't in some museum or archaeological park. It's right on the main street downtown. Right on the main square, you have an old Roman temple, so you'll get a sense of the layering of history that takes place here. Then we're going to head into the countryside. Some of my favorite parts of the Croatian interior are in this Istrian peninsula. Lots of beautiful hill towns with charming cobbled lanes. We're actually going to spend the night in one of these hill towns. This is a town called Motovun, beautiful hill town overlooking forests, oak forests that have truffles and wineries and so forth. This one gets the Rick Steves seal of approval. And we find this is a great place, just a small town. We actually sleep in a former castle that's been turned into a hotel. There's a church on the main square that was done by Andrea Palladio, a famous Italian architect. For a small town, there's a lot to do here in Motovun. But mostly it's fun just to relax and watch the sunset over the Croatian interior. It's a great chance to try some local Croatian wines, and we are going to make sure throughout the tour to introduce you to the local foods and wines. Croatian wine, like Hungarian wine, we talked earlier about the Hungarian wine tasting, was collectivized under the communist system, and quality really plummeted. It was all nationalized. What's happened in the last 15, 20, 25 years is vintners are returning to their historic plots, and they're relearning how to make great wines. And these days, Croatian wines are very well respected. Some famous Croatian wines appear on wine lists at really fancy restaurants in New York and Paris and London. Croatian wine is really enjoying a renaissance, and we'll make sure you get a chance to sample some of that. In the area that Rovinj and Motovun are in, this little area called Istria, they've got some great truffles, so that's something that you can enjoy in your free time here. Throughout this whole region, though, Croatia and Slovenia, there's a lot of what you might think of as Italian-style food, so you have a lot of pizzas, lots of different kinds of pastas, and of course, with all that coastline, there's a lot of seafood. And throughout the course of the tour, when we have meals together, of course, half of your dinners are included in the tour. We'll give you a taste of all these local flavors, and then on your free time, we'll give you advice for where to go and enjoy those. When we leave this area called Istria, we head into the interior even more and go to this Plitvice Lakes National Park. This is the one overnight stop that's overlapped with Eastern Europe. We've really carefully planned this itinerary not to overlap too much, but this is the one place both tours. And I've never heard anyone complain about going here twice. These are these spectacular waterfalls and boardwalks that I showed you a little bit earlier. So that's really a hit on this itinerary. What's interesting is right near that national park is also a place where we're going to see a little bit of damage from the war that took place here in Croatia. There were two waves of the war, 1992 and 1995. And we'll see bombed out buildings and memorials to soldiers who died here, and even buildings that still have bullet holes that haven't yet been repaired. It's a great opportunity, again, for your tour guide to help you understand the conflicts that racked the former Yugoslavia in the mid-1990s, early to mid-1990s. That's a major factor of this tour. From there, we head on south to the Dalmatian coast. The Dalmatian coast is about the southern third of the Croatian coastline, the most famous, and justifiably so, part of the Croatian coastline. We're going to start out with 2 nights in the big city of Split. And a lot of the islands in Croatia are pretty romantic kind of backwaters, small towns. What I like about Split is it's a big city. It's a real vital city. It has a lot of tourism, but it's not overwhelmed by tourism, so it gives you a good taste of a big urban coastal city in Croatia. It's a great place, even though there's a lot of sightseeing, just to relax and watch the world go by. They have this wonderful pedestrian promenade called the Riva that faces the harbor, where you can sit out and sip a coffee or lick an ice cream cone. Day and night, you just basically watch people go by. You know, in Italy, they have this concept called the passeggiata. In Spain, they call it the paseo. It's the idea that after dinner, you gather your family, and you just go for an aimless stroll through the streets of town. You're not walking anywhere in particular. You're just trying to connect with your neighbors and enjoy the ambiance. And it exists here in Croatia as well. You really see it on display here on the Riva. Historically, and from a sightseeing perspective, Split is also really interesting because the old town of Split is built in the remains of a former Roman retirement palace. Now, I didn't say that there's a retirement palace in the old town of Split. The floor plan of the retirement palace literally became the street plan of the city of Split. After the fall of Rome, when all of these buildings were in disrepair, basically scavengers moved in and they turned the hallways of the palace into the streets of the old town of Split. They turned the main entryway of the palace into the main square of the town of Split. So the people who live in the old town of Split literally have walls in their houses that are 2,000 years old. This was the retirement palace of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who ruled around the 2nd century AD. He was notorious for executing Christians, some say even in the basement of his own mausoleum. But then there's this sort of layering of history and this wonderful poetic justice. The mausoleum of Diocletian, which is this boxy structure you see here, is now part of the cathedral and has been capped with a Venetian-style bell tower. So one thing I love as a tour guide is taking people here, and there couldn't be a more on-the-nose visual demonstration of the layers of history in a place like Split. And we'll also take you down underground. They actually had to build what we would sort of call a daylight basement. They had to build these cellars to level out the ground to allow the palace to be built, and you can tour those cellars now. The old Temple of Jupiter has now become a baptistry, which is decorated by a sculpture by a great Croatian sculptor named Ivan Meštrović. This is him. And as I mentioned earlier, I love learning about artists that I'd never heard of before, and then you go to their homeland and you find how incredibly talented they were. And I wanted Marian to tell us a little bit about Ivan Meštrović.
Well, Split, first, is a fascinating place where, like in so few places elsewhere, you can experience this fusion of past and present. I mean, you don't really have many places in the world that were born out of the nucleus of a Roman emperor's palace and a vibrant Mediterranean port today. And as you visit it, you become part of this fascinating story. And partially for those reasons, this is also why one of Croatia's greatest sculptors, Ivan Meštrović, decided to choose it as his home. He's not very well known today maybe in the States, even though he was in his own time, he was active in the first half of the 20th century, quite renowned internationally. But due to the tumultuous period of especially of World War II, his career, let's say, and his plans for retirement in Split took a hit. He basically, at the end of his rich career, set up this beautiful, gorgeous villa on the seaside in the most beautiful part of town where he would retire. But unfortunately, that was not to be. A similar story, just like with Emperor Diocletian, 17 centuries earlier. Meštrović was actually from a very poor little village in the Croatian countryside, but his talents were recognized already as a little boy. And through other affluent people who sponsored his education, he made it all the way to the back then capital of the area, Vienna, and to the art academy. And from there, he took an important part in the Art Nouveau art movement that was blossoming there, and studying Greek sculpture, combining that with his own personal notes, especially after his close friendship with Rodin. Some of his incredible artistic style was born, and he exhibited that time between the two world wars all over the world. And unfortunately, like I said, he was getting ready to retire in Split, enjoy all of that. And then World War II happened. He did not agree with the fascist regime that took power in Croatia. So after briefly being imprisoned, he managed to escape to the US. And after World War II, he didn't agree with the new communist regime either. So he spent the rest of his life in the US, where he ended up being a professor at Notre Dame University. And even in the US, actually have a number of his artworks for that precise reason. Probably among the more famous ones, the statues at Grant Park in Chicago of the Native American crossbow and spearmen, and several others. So it's not probably a name that you would be familiar with from before, but again, this is what travel is all about, making discoveries like these, and Mištrović is definitely on the list of things that we introduce you to.
Thank you very much. Well said, Marian. And this is that retirement palace Mištrović built for himself, and it didn't quite pan out, but now it's been turned into a museum of his works. So if you're intrigued by Ivan Mištrović in your free time in Split, you're welcome to go and tour this museum. We're going to leave Split and do some island hopping. So we've spent a couple of days in the big coastal city of Split, and now it's time to get some island fun. Island fun. On our way south, we're actually going to stop on one island on our way to spend the night in the next island. So you'll see 2 islands in one day. The island we're stopping off at is called Hvar. It's a little tricky to pronounce, H-V-A-R, Hvar. Each of the Croatian islands sort of has its own personality, its own claims to fame. In the case of Hvar, it's sort of the jet-set island. It's trying to cultivate sort of a Saint-Tropez kind of image. It's trying to get celebrities and fancy yachters to come. So it's quite expensive. It's kind of a good thing we don't spend the night here, because restaurants and hotels are very expensive. But you will get a few hours to get a good look at this beautiful city. You can see really fancy yachts moored here in the harbor. It's got a beautiful church that you can tour, but for most people it's fun just to stroll the back lanes and then hike up to this beautiful fortress overlooking the city, where you've got spectacular views over the harbor of Hvar, the rooftops of the town, and the offshore islands. So you'll have maybe, I think it's 3 or 4 hours, let's say, on Hvar to look around. Then we're going to board another boat and head to a different island to spend the night. This is an island called Korčula. And Korčula is a little bit sleepier, a little bit more off the beaten path. And it's a kind of place that makes you jump for joy at the end of a busy day of island hopping. Again, this is a chance to simply relax. Like Rovin on the Eastern Europe tour, here on the Adriatic tour, you go to Korčula to take a vacation from your busy vacation. You can do a little sightseeing, you can go to the church, but it's even more fun just to sit out, sunbathe, go for a dip, maybe rent a kayak. Just simply enjoy your day off before we continue on our tour. For the next stop, we wanted to splice in a really exciting and something very different stop for this tour, and that is to cross into another one of the countries of the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, or Bosnia for short. In just basically 3 hours from all of the big coastal destinations in Croatia, you can be in the city of Mostar, which feels completely different. The climate is totally different. Again, it looks and feels more Turkish than it does sort of Venetian or Italian, which is what the Croatian coastline looks like. And Mostar is a really delightful place where we'll spend the night, have a chance to see the town with a local guide, and learn about the very powerful history here. The famous symbol of Mostar is this gorgeous bridge, which was built about 400 years ago by the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. During the recent wars of the 1990s, 20 years ago or so, the bridge was bombarded by forces on the hilltop above, and literally eventually was destroyed and fell into the river. And now it's been rebuilt and has become a very powerful symbol of reconciliation. And there's this great tradition where guys jump from the top of the bridge and plunge down into the icy waters below, sort of a celebration of life. They've been doing it before the bridge was destroyed. They did it while the bridge was gone, and now they're still doing it now that the bridge is back. Mostar has kind of a Turkish feel. You've got this sort of bazaar-like main street where you can go shopping. And of course, we'll take you into a mosque to learn a little bit more about the Muslim faith. It's not the only faith in Mostar. There's also Catholics and Eastern Orthodox followers. But you'll learn a little bit about the Muslim faith and culture here. A lot of people just sort of day trip to Mostar from the Croatian coast, but we're really happy to spend the night to dig deeper and learn more about this city. I also feel like as a tour guide, I love going to Mostar because it gives us a chance to introduce Americans to Islam, which is a faith that's incredibly important and I think often misunderstood. Just as we feel like our Turkey tour is a very important part of our tour program, on this tour, this stop in Mostar gives us a chance to learn a little bit more about this faith. Our grand finale for the Adriatic tour is a doozy. This is Dubrovnik, the pearl of the Adriatic at the very southern tip of Croatia. It's a gigantic walled town that juts proudly out into the Adriatic. By the way, if you're a fan of the show Game of Thrones, most of that is filmed here in Dubrovnik. I've been catching up on that lately, and I keep saying, hey, I know that park. Hey, I know that castle. Just to give you a sense of how majestic this place is, that fantasy shows film here. It's really spectacular. We have 2 nights here, and we have a great chance to just sort of get a look at this great walled city of Dubrovnik. From the entry gate to the main drag, it's just a delightful place to explore. Marian was saying earlier about Ljubljana. There's no big monuments, there's no huge museums. It's the same thing here in Dubrovnik. There's some interesting museums and sites, but no must-sees. So you can just relax. We'll take you on an orientation tour to get your bearings. You can go into some of the churches if you'd like. There's some beautiful, restful cloisters. You can explore to your heart's content. You can go out to the little port there, where there are excursion boats that go out to the offshore islands, where you can get away from some of the crowds and go for a swim. Skinny little lanes lead up from the main drag to the peaks of the roof high above. There's also a cable car that takes you to the mountaintop above Dubrovnik, which gives you spectacular views down on that walled old town. This gives you a sense of the full size of it. And from here, you can actually see 3 different countries, just to give you a sense of this being a place where cultures come together. You're standing on Croatia. At the southern tip here, you see actually Montenegro, and just over your left shoulder, you're right next to Bosnia-Herzegovina. It really drives home the point that this is a crossroad of cultures. If you want to unwind, you can go to the beach, either near or far from the old town. You can even go swimming right off of the old town wall itself, do a backstroke while looking up at the finest walled city in medieval Europe. Our favorite activity that we really highly recommend that you do is to hike around the walls of the old town of Dubrovnik. It takes about an hour at a pretty steady pace with some stops to take some pictures, and it's just the most spectacular way to get a full dose of the beautiful scenery here. You've got a sea of red rooftops on one side and the actual sea on the other side. Fortresses and other structures to walk through. And as you're walking around those rooftops, you might notice that there's a lot of new shiny rooftops and some older, kind of beat up looking rooftops. And this is a somber reminder that Dubrovnik is another one of the places on this tour that was badly damaged in the wars of the 1990s. Just 20 years ago, the city was laid siege to and in ruins, but like the rest of the region, it's really bounced back. They've done a really amazing job of reconstructing, rebuilding, bringing the place back to life. So when you walk around the rooftops, you can see about 80% are new, which means that the buildings were destroyed and had to be replaced, and about 20% are old. As you're walking around those rooftops, you look down, and there you see, sticking like a barnacle to the outside of the city wall, a drink bar. It's called Cold Drinks Buja. Buja means hole in the wall, and that's literally what you have to climb through to get out here. Sit out, enjoy a drink, watch the cruise ships sail off into the sunset, and think about what a wonderful itinerary we've enjoyed here on the Best of the Adriatic in 14 days.